Hello. Welcome back, my true crime junkies. This is Ida, your host. And if you are new to my show, welcome to my podcast. Make sure that you do subscribe on the page below so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Our podcast is available on any of your favorite platforms. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. So if you need the link, you can find it in Instagram or any of those platforms, and you can subscribe from there. And if you have any comments or any case you would like to bring to my attention and suggest, you can send me a message through the comments as well, or a private message. I am trying to bring today a case. This is an actual case that had a so-so of a good ending to it. It did not happen in the U.S. It is an international case. Today we are going to be talking about a young girl named Elisabeth Fritzl. This is something that took place in a small town called Amstetten in Lower Austria. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but I apologize. Elisabeth was born April 6, 1966. Her parents are Josef and Rosemary Fritzl. In 1956, at the age of 21, Josef married Rosemary. She was 17 at that time. And they met and fell in love, and just, they were young. The pair seemed to hit it off, and right away they walked down the aisle in 1956. Together they welcomed 7 children, including Elisabeth. For years, Joseph made a name for himself with multiple positions within the construction business, where he ended up settling as a technical equipment salesman. This gave him a big chance to travel Austria, but that wasn't all that was in his mind. It seems that Joseph was also concerned about his young daughter Elisabeth quickly becoming a young woman who had thoughts about leaving home. Elisabeth left school at just the age of 15 years old. Although Rosemary and Joseph shared 7 children, it seemed to be that Elisabeth was the one that caused them the most concern. And at the time, teens in that country were only required to stay in school until they were 15 years old. And it quickly appeared that Elisabeth had enough of her education, as she dropped out shortly after her birthday. That didn't mean Elisabeth was about to take whatever life threw her way, as the teen had plans for the rest of her life. She quickly enrolled in a waitressing course and was almost through when she ran away from home in 1983. That was until the police discovered Elisabeth and her friend in Vienna and brought him back home to her parents. At that time, Joseph started building the family basement for years and merely needed just doors. And sadly, in August 28 of 1984, that will soon become the day Elisabeth will never forget. She always kept trying to make her dad happy, being that they were always disappointed in her. So she would try and help him with anything he asked, including helping him with his basement project. As she was hanging a door, she turned to leave and quickly found herself falling into the darkness. Elisabeth wouldn't see the outside again for the next 24 years. And that's where it all begins. Elisabeth was never destined to leave the basement once she had the door put in place. At just 18 years old, she had been trapped by the man who was meant to protect her father, Joseph. He held a cloth over her face until she passed out, before moving her into his chamber, where she remained. She woke up to darkness and quickly realized that she literally helped her dad finish his project, placed a door to her own prison cell. She might have just been 20 feet from her family, but being underground meant Elisabeth had no way to tell the world she was trapped with no way to ever escape. One of the many things her dad, Joseph, had to consider was how to hide his new rooms and to ensure that Elisabeth would never be able to escape. To start, it was a metal door that was sealed shut due to the weight and rust. However, that wasn't the only way in and out. Joseph also installed a metal door that was complete with reinforced concrete. to make things even more secure, someone could only open the door with a remote control from the outside. Eventually, Joseph created a labyrinth of 8 doors to ensure Elisabeth would never be discovered and he could continue with his horrific plan for his daughter. Rosemary was initially worried about where Elisabeth had gone. Don't forget, Rosemary's her mom. Although her daughter was seemingly missing to the rest of the world, it appeared that Elisabeth's mom was the only one concerned about her daughter missing. Rosemary was the only one to file a missing report on Elisabeth when she didn't return home, with no idea that she was just feet away from her child, trapped in the basement right below her. Elisabeth disappeared in 1984 at the age of 18 without a trace, and no one had any idea where to turn. It looked as though the world was going to have to accept that they would never have an idea what happened to her. Elisabeth was forced to write a letter explaining that she had run away. It was almost as though runaway Elisabeth knew that her family would start to panic about her, as conveniently the letter arrived in the mail. Here, the teen confessed that she had no choice but to run away as she was tired of living with the family. Sadly, this was nothing more than a story fabricated by her dad, Joseph. Elisabeth was basically forced to write the letter to make it sound genuine, and everyone believed it was true, thanks to her previous escape attempts. Before, Elisabeth was brought home, because she was underage every time she ran away. Now, Joseph told people that his daughter had joined a cult, and there was nothing they could do to bring her back home because now she was an adult. It didn't take long for Joseph to develop a new daily routine. While the rest of the world learned to live without Elisabeth, she was about to find herself locked for 24 years in the basement, living each day on repeat. This is an awful thing to live. Joseph settled into his new routine of having 2 lives as he continued to keep his daughter prisoner. Even Elisabeth's family started to believe that she had ran away. Unfortunately, things took an even darker turn into her 24 years confinement, as Elisabeth was released from her bed so that she could be abused by her father. Being able to move around the basement didn't mean Elisabeth had hopes she could escape. After all, she was just 20 feet underground, living behind a host of industrial doors. The abuse she faced from her father was too common for Elisabeth. As the years passed, Elisabeth grew used to being abused multiple times a day. Unfortunately, this was all too common for the teen, who had been suffering at the hands of her father since she was 11 years old. Things got even worse when Elisabeth tried to leave, as someone would always bring her back home to them. 2 years into her captivity, Elisabeth's life took another turn when she discovered she was pregnant. Knowing that Joseph was the father was allegedly enough to terrify the youngster, and she ultimately learned she lost the baby at 10 weeks. Elisabeth later learned she was pregnant again, carrying baby Kirsten to full term in 1988. 2 years later, she welcomed a son named Stefan, meaning Elisabeth now had to learn how to protect them too. She wanted to keep things as normal as possible for her 2 young children. Living underground and at the hands of her father meant Elisabeth quickly lost her grip on reality with every day that passed. However, she couldn't curl up and try to ignore the situation she found herself in, as she now had 2 little ones to raise. This was amongst being left barely enough food for them. It was said that Elisabeth would have to make the meal stretch and try to create some kind of routine for Kirsten and Stefan. Elisabeth basically started teaching her children basic education, as she hoped to shield them from Joseph and the best, try and protect them as the best as she could in the little space. Sadly, there was no way to hide that they were living underground in a cramped basement. Elisabeth never lost her hope she would escape being locked for 24 years in the basement. The years continued to pass, and Elisabeth was forced to welcome even more children. Sadly, not all of them were allowed to live with their mother, as Joseph quickly decided that he wanted to play a larger part in raising his children than visiting them a few times a week in the basement he had built. Lisa was born August 1992, but he left her in a cardboard box outside his own home at just 9 months old. Apparently, Joseph hoped that if Elisabeth wrote a note explaining she had welcomed a daughter but couldn't cope, he could raise Lisa with Rosemary. Amazingly, his plan seemed to work, and Joseph soon stepped up as Lisa's grandfather. Less than 18 months after Lisa was found outside at the Fritzl home, Rosemary had another surprise when a 10-month-old Monica was found in the similar way in the front porch. This is incredible. And however, this time there was no note, so Rosemary seemed to know she needed to take care of her grandchild and had no idea she would soon hear from Elisabeth for the first time in years. On April 28th of 1996, Elisabeth welcomed yet more children as she gave birth to twins. Sadly, one of the boys lost his life less than 3 days after he was born, leaving Joseph with a new problem on his hands. While his brother Alexander survived, Joseph knew he needed to cover his tracks before anyone got suspicious. Joseph decided the best thing to do was to cremate the infant so no one would ever discover his remains. Alexander, he was allowed to live with Elisabeth and his 2 older siblings until he was 15 months old, and then torn away from his family. Alexander was eventually found like his other siblings and taken into by Rosemary and Joseph. So he just continued having babies with Elisabeth, his daughter, and placing some of the babies out in the porch as Elisabeth was just dropping them off. But in reality, it was him. He refused to take any more children into the home as Rosemary couldn't cope anymore. For years, it appeared as though Rosemary had no choice but to believe Elisabeth was out there somewhere in the world. All she knew was that her daughter was allegedly welcoming children into the world and had no way to take care of them. So she continued to leave them to the only people she knew, her parents. Although Elisabeth welcomed another son named Felix, he decided that Rosemary couldn't look after any more children as she was already overwhelmed by the 3 new additions. Instead, Felix was ordered to live his life in the basement with Elisabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan. It's unknown if Felix even knew about his siblings living 20 feet above the basement. Joseph knew he had to cover his tracks if he wanted to get away with raising a family below his home. However, he also needed to give Rosemary something to hold on to and reasons to not call the police. So he created an elaborate plan. All Joseph needed to do was force Elisabeth to write more letters. Elisabeth had no idea what was happening to her children upstairs, had no way to protect them. However, there was every hope they got to enjoy a better life than the one downstairs in the basement. It is said that Elisabeth had nothing more than an old book about childbirth, some disinfectants, and dirty pair of socks to prepare for each child. Of course, this meant that Elisabeth could have easily lost her life each time that she had a baby. Sadly, she thought about ending her own life multiple times, but before she had she had her baby, so she had to think about the kids now, so that changed her mind. However, things took a turn when her eldest daughter, Kirsten, fell ill in 2008. She was 19 years old at the time, but Joseph was determined to heal his daughter/granddaughter with over-the-counter medicine. Sadly, nothing was enough, and Elisabeth knew that Kirsten would lose her life if she didn't get proper medical attention soon. So Elisabeth had spent years trying to protect the children, even if she could only do so from confines of the basement. Kirsten was getting more sick each day that passed, and her mother worried more and more if she didn't get help. It weighed on her constantly as Elisabeth begged Joseph to get some help. Eventually, Joseph agreed. Agreed to her Elisabeth's request, but only under certain circumstances. He took Kirsten outside